Part 1, Prologue. Introduction. Alexander the Great opened a new era in the history of the world, and by his life's work determined its development for many centuries. He is conspicuous among the great men of history, because this work was accomplished in so short a span. When he died, he had not yet reached his 33rd year. It was as a great conqueror that he impressed the popular imagination of every race. He subdued the East and penetrated into India, that land of wonders. The legend about him, equally current in East and West, took him to the limits of the earth and even to the gates of paradise. The permanent result of his life, however, was not the empire which he won by hard fighting, but the development of a Greek civilization into a civilization which was worldwide. It is in this way that his influence has affected the history of mankind even down to our own time. He had first to create his empire. The decision of the battlefield had, as usual, to produce the external conditions for the new civilization. In the disputed question, what are the forces which make and mold history? Alexander is the strongest instance in favor of the view which maintained the decisive importance of personality. One cannot comprehend a genius like Alexander from the surroundings in which he lived, or as a product of his age and country. He was, of course, like any other man affected by his period and birthplace. But his spirit took a course of its own, to which the natural development of his age and surroundings would never have led by itself. Like every great leader of men, he threw himself into the currents of his epoch, but he did not allow himself to be merely lifted and carried forward on their waves, where they were in opposition to his own ideas. He vigorously struggled against them. No doubt we can trace before him in the 4th century phenomena and tendencies which we may regard as forerunners of Hellenism, the name we apply to the latter transformation of the classical Hellenic world that he inaugurated. And yet they are only forerunners, to which he first gave full effect. They show that in many respects he only fulfilled the aims of his own time. The preliminary work of his great father, Philip, was most important. From him he inherited not only the instrument of victory, the incomparable Macedonian army, but also the solution of the Greek question in the Corinthian League, and the idea of a pan-Hellenic campaign of revanche against Persia. Doubtless, in pursuance of his own ideas, Alexander gradually modified this inheritance and diverged from his father's path. But without Philip, who is equally one of the great personalities of the world's history, Alexander cannot be understood. We shall therefore have first to present to ourselves the political, intellectual, and economic tendencies of the Greek world of the 4th century, so far as they contribute to an estimate of the rise of Macedonia under Philip and to our appreciation of Alexander. Chapter 1. The Greek world in the 4th century down to Philip. After the collapse of Athens and the Athenian Empire in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was left victor and proceeded with brutal violence to establish her supremacy over the Greeks and to introduce oligarchic institutions in place of the democracies previously favored by Athens. The victory, however, had not been won by her own strength, but only through the scandalous alliance with Persia, which was purchased by the sacrifice to the great king of the brethren of Asia Minor, the descendants of the old Aeolian, Ionian, and Dorian colonists. Irritated by the senseless attitude of the radical Democrats of Athens, who, in spite of the renewal of the Peace of Calais by Darius II, had interfered with the internal affairs of the Persian Empire, the great king had since 412 supported the Spartans with his inexhaustible purse. In return for this, they were prepared, without any nationalistic qualms, to surrender to him the Greeks of Asia Minor, for whose liberation the Delian League organized by Athens had fought under Athenian leadership down to 448, when we may date the Peace of Calais. It was Persian gold that built the fleets with which the Spartans overcame the resistance of Athens and finally, 404, starved it into surrender, and thus at one stroke the Persian Empire, in spite of internal weakness, had become the determining factor in Greek history. It is true that Sparta, who soon fell out with her ally and had already compromised herself at Susa, by her secret support of Prince Cyrus in his march with the famous 10,000 against his brother Artaxerxes Menoman, drew the sword against Persia, according to the official account, in order to protect the Asiatic Greeks, who were about to be punished for the participation in that expedition. But patriotic motives can hardly have been in the deciding factor with the Spartans, who had previously in cold blood awarded those cities to the Persians. It was, rather, the desire to retain the powerful position which they had won in Asia Minor, chiefly through the great Lysander, and perhaps also the wish, as lords of Greece, to purge themselves of the stain of the Persian alliance. But while Sparta's armies, first under other commanders and finally under Agesilaus, were fighting the Persians overseas, at home, the hatred evoked by the brutal reign of force the Spartans had exercised there brought together Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos in a coalition, which compelled Agesilaus to break off the war with Persia and to fight in Hellas against the allies. Then again Persian gold played its part, this time on the side of the allies. More decisive in its effect than the victory of Agesilaus at Coronia was the victory of the Persian fleet at Cnidus under the command of the Athenian Conon, 394. This meant the collapse of Spartan power at sea, and Conon was able to have the walls of his native city rebuilt, though by Persian money. This melancholy civil war, however, which shockingly exhibits the miserable and incurable divisions of the Greek nation, continued with varying success for many years. After the rise of Athens had emboldened the Athenians to support the revolt from Persia of the Cypriot prince Argolas and the rebellion of Egypt, and had by a new grouping of powers brought Sparta into connection with Persia, the so-called King's Peace were concluded in 386, which was also called after the clever Spartan who negotiated in the Peace of Antalcidas. As early as 392, this Antalcidas, together with the satrap Teribazus, had debated terms of peace with the representatives of the allies at Sardis. Then the Athenians were still strong enough to be the only allied state which refused the Persian demand for the cession of the coast of Asia Minor, on the patriotic ground that they could not admit that the Greeks who lived in Asia belonged to the great king. For this and other reasons the negotiations broke down, but now Antalcidas, who was also a skillful admiral, succeeded, with the additional support of ships from Dionysius I of Syracuse, in closing the Dardanelles to the Athenians, and bringing to bear on them the same compulsion as in 405. Resistance was no longer possible. The Greeks had obediently to receive the peace, which the great king sent down to them from Susa to Sardis in the most humiliating form by the hand of Antalcidas, with whom he had settled its terms. The king's edict comprised 2 clauses and a sanction. The first clause laid down that all the Greek cities in Asia, as well as the islands of Clazomenae and Cyprus, should belong to the great king. The second, that all other Greek cities, great and small, should be free and independent, the only exception being the clericies of Lemnos, Imbros, and Cycros, which were left to Athens. The sanction stated that the king, in conjunction with the states that were of the same mind, would wage war by sea and land against anyone who did not accept the peace. On the basis of this edict, the peace was confirmed at Sparta by the oaths of all present at the Congress. Thus the Hellenic brethren on the other side of the sea were finally awarded to the great king. The clause about autonomy corresponded not only to the interest of the Persian monarch, to whom it implied the impermanent subdivision of Greece into countless sovereign communities, polias, but in particular to the interest of Sparta, inasmuch as all leagues of states which did not guarantee autonomy were thereby excluded. Accordingly, the Theban League was immediately dissolved, while the Peloponnesian League, the members of which were nominally autonomous, remained in existence under the leadership of Sparta. In this respect, the king's peace was a triumph for Sparta, who had now to superintend the strict execution of its terms in the sorry role of Persian agent. No doubt many short-sighted particularists, who were incapable of learning by experience, were well content that the old ideal of freedom and independence was guaranteed to each individual polis. But the better elements felt it to be a disgrace that this peace, which, as Isocrates put it, was not a treaty but a dictation, had been forced on them by the Persian king, and that he now, as official guarantor, exercised the supreme control over Greek policy. The disgrace was all the more crying, as the military superiority of the Greeks was unquestionable after the expedition of the 10,000, and might have made a conquest of Persia possible, if in place of their disunion, a unification of Greek forces could have been carried out. It is of prime importance for the understanding of the 4th century to realize that this shameful peace of 386 was a fundamental law in Hellas for fully half a century, and a burden which was now more, now less galling. Philip first cut the ground from under it by uniting the nation in his Corinthian League, and Alexander completely abolished it by the destruction of the Persian Empire. The conclusion of the king's peace was followed by years of difficulty for Greece. during which Sparta used her new hegemony to extend her power still further. As a protection against Spartan encroachments, Athens succeeded in 377 in founding a new Attic Naval League, in which, according to the terms of the king's peace, it guaranteed freedom and autonomy to each member of the league. By care in avoiding the faults which had produced the dissolution of the first Naval League in the 5th century, a new organization was created, the chief point being that the members each sent a representative to a federal council, Synhedrion, sitting at Athens, which had to keep in touch with the assembly of the Athenian people, while this league in the next following years was extended in northern and central Greece, and in the islands of the east and west by successful operations of the Attic generals Cabirius and Timotheus. Thebes had in the meantime rapidly risen to power in the struggle with Sparta under the leadership of Epaminondas. On the recovery of the citadel, the Cadmea, which the Spartans had seized in time of peace by a brutal violation of international law, Epaminondas' immediate aim was the formation of a united Boeotian state, and when at the Peace Congress at Sparta in 371, objection was raised to this on the ground of the king's peace. He defied the Congress and at Leuctra inflicted so severe a defeat on the Spartan king, Cleombrotus, that Sparta's military predominance was at an end forever. This battle of Leuctra was also of the greatest significance for the development of the Macedonian military system, the so-called oblique battle array, which Epaminondas, its inventor and one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, first appeared here, was later adopted and expanded by King Philip, and with it Alexander won the day in his 3 great pitched battles, as did Frederick the Great at Leuthen. Sparta was prostrate and could not interfere in the following years, when Epaminondas, by repeated expeditions into the Peloponnese, rendered it completely impotent, by robbing it of Messenia, on whose harvest and supply of labor its economic and political position largely rested, and by the organization of a federal Arcadian state with a newly created capital, Megalopolis. But the aims of Epaminondas flew higher. He was working for the hegemony of all Greece. If, as was once erroneously assumed, his intention had been a pan-Hellenic national policy, he would, as the political situation then was, have been bound to attempt the unification of Hellas under the leadership of Thebes for a war against Persia and the destruction of the supremacy of the great king. Instead of that, he fell a victim to the curse of his age. In order to win domination over the other Greeks, he made overtures to the Persian king, to whom the rise of Attic sea power was as much an eyesore as it was an obstacle in his own path, and caused his ambassadors, Pelopidas among them, to dance attendance at Susa, and humbly beg for the cooperation of the great king. But in 362, when Epaminondas fell at Mantinia, in a battle which he again had arranged with genius, the policy of Thebes as a great power collapsed, since it did not correspond to the actual strength of the state, and had only been maintained by his personality. This episode of Theban hegemony was of no permanent value to the Greeks. It merely caused an aching void in the military strength of the nation by the annihilation of Sparta. Nor was the Second Attic Naval League destined to flourish long. In spite of the promises of 377, Athens began to slip back again into the policy of the First League in its dealings with the members, and in 357 Chios, Rhodes, and Kos, incited by the intrigues of Mausolus of Caria, revolted and seceded. Nothing can throw a more lurid light on the impotent condition of Greece than the fact that after unsuccessful fighting, Athens in 355 was forced, by the threat of a declaration of war by the Persian king, to let the seceders go. This was the new and vigorous king, Artaxerxes III Ocus. Thus Athens too resigned the position of the sovereign great power, and the result was universal chaos in Greece. Opposed to the Greeks stood the Persian monarchy. Certainly at times it seemed to be approaching dissolution through the revolt of satraps and provinces. But by the help of Greek mercenaries, it constantly maintained its existence. The unity of the empire was first and foremost. Whereas in Greece there was a permanent division, out of which there seemed no way leading to unification of forces. If this conflict of the Greek states with one another was discomforting, no less so were the internal conditions of the various poleis. Whether democrats or oligarchs held sway, the oppositions of the hostile parties became everywhere embittered, and the domination of the victorious became ever more destructive to the defeated. The radical tendencies of democracies, such as Athens, which had begun in the 5th century, grew ever more extreme. The rule of the proletariat under the leadership of its demagogues developed more and more into a class domination, and the popular tribunals, which, since the raising of the payment of members, were overwhelmingly composed of the poorer citizens, dealt out a class justice, which was directed not merely against political opponents, but specially against property owners as such, with an eye to the confiscation of their property. It was at bottom a struggle of the poor against the rich, and in this process the most radical demands were raised, such as for a new division of land, the abolition of debts, and so forth. In oligarchic states, the war of classes was carried on with the same passion from the opposite point of view. Thus, the exiles and bankrupts formed an ever-increasing proletariat without means or occupation, such as Isocrates describes in 380 and with greater emphasis in 346. This became a danger to the whole of Hellas. There were then no great industrial concerns to supply work for these masses. Many turned to brigandage on the country roads, or as pirates rendered the sea unsafe, but most of them were driven by want to enlist as mercenaries in the service of the potentate, who offered the highest pay. This mercenary system was a deep-seated evil which affected the whole nation. The gold of the Persian king was the chief attraction. After the shock of the expedition of the 10,000, he endeavored more and more to prop up his power by armies of Greek mercenaries. But his efforts were partly defeated, because rebel satraps in countries like Egypt also enlisted Greek mercenaries to fight against him. Many of the most prominent generals of the day, if they were unemployed or disgusted by political conditions at home, entered foreign service, and often turned the scales in fighting for or against the great king. What a waste of national vigor this was for the benefit of foreigners! The ease with which mercenaries could be found had another mischievous consequence. In Greece, too many civic communities began to enlist mercenaries in order to escape more or less from the duty of bearing arms themselves. Even when the Athenian Ithraketes was organizing a new body of light-armed peltists, it appeared that citizens thought themselves too good to undergo the severe drill required by this new formation, and preferred to recruit mercenaries instead. The worst result was the decay of the old idea of the state, which had once inspired citizens with the proud conscience that it was their highest and noblest duty to defend their state with their property and their blood. The state came to be regarded more and more as an institution of maintenance, whose chief task was to assure the citizen of as easy and comfortable a life as possible, and to organize for him many magnificent festivals. Thus, at Athens, after the above-mentioned inglorious end of the social war in the 50s, the inevitable result was a pacifism, which abandoned the policy of imperial power, provided that material interests were promoted. But not only had the idea of the polis been lowered in the hard struggle of actual life, it had also been shaken by the theories of the leading intellectuals. The individualism, preached by the sophists in the far-reaching intellectual revolution of the 5th century, seriously threatened the feeling which had hitherto prevailed on the subject of the state. To the laws which had formed for the citizen of the polis, the supreme rule of life, the sophists opposed the natural rights of the individual, and declared the laws to be only the conventional ordinance of man. In proclaiming the right of the stronger, they struck at the roots of the polis. How dangerous the translation of these doctrines into practice could be appeared from the deliberate attempt of Alcibiades to play the Superman. Socrates certainly combated the aberrations of sophistic, but even his requirements of professional training for the citizens and the formation of the government out of experts implied the complete transformation of the ancient polis. The real downfall of the polis, which took place in the 4th century, led only to the strengthening of individualism and the abandonment of the idea of a ruling state. The conception of the individual, who is sufficient unto himself by knowledge and morality, so that he has no need of the state, led the Socratic Antisthenes, the founder of the Cynic school, the son of a Thracian woman, who could not become a citizen of Athens, to the ideal of an all-embracing community of mankind. And thus arises the cosmopolitan idea, which was developed further by his pupil Diogenes of Sinope, who coined the word cosmopolites, citizens of the world, the fatal phrase, which has exercised its dangerous fascination down to the present day. However different the world empire created by Alexander was from this cosmopolis, There is no question that this idea of the Cynics was one of the elements of the 4th century, which prepared the Hellenic mind for his universal empire. But there set in a reaction against this individualistic tendency. Numerous thinkers appeared, who, though disgusted with the state of the day, would not deny the idea of the state, but wanted to cure the maladies of the polis by proposals of reform. The boldest and most radical is the wonderful fabric, which Plato, the greatest Athenian of the time, erected in his Republic, in which he drew the ideal state of justice. Later he was compelled to see that this construction was only suitable for gods, and at the end of his life he drew out a new ideal picture, taking more account of the actual world, that of the laws, in which he put in the forefront the strict legal cohesion which he had rejected in the Republic. Though the starting points and conclusions of the theorists differed widely, many of them agreed in one point, in the idea that monarchy is the ideal form of government. This awakening of the monarchical idea is one of the influences which paved the way in Greece for the successes of Philip and Alexander. It may be traced back to the individualism of the 5th century. In practice, it was promoted not only by the decline of the polis, but by the appearance of strong rulers on the outskirts of the Greek world, who defended or advanced Greek interest, such as Dionysius I of Syracuse, who protected the western Greeks against Carthage, or Jason of Pherae, the powerful lord of Thessaly, on whom many hopes were based, or even Eurygoras of Cyprus. The first of the theorists to arrive at the monarchical solution was the above-mentioned Cynic, Antisthenes. It was a consequence of his cosmopolitan views, that he saw in the Cynic model of the one perfect wise man the ideal head of this world association of mankind. The fashion of the age was to look back into the past to find a basis for requirements for the future. And so Antisthenes presented Heracles as the mythical pattern, who by his ceaseless services had been a benefactor of mankind. And from the history of the world he selected the great Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, and portrayed him as Persian legends knew him, the ideal monarch who cared for his subjects as a father for his children or a shepherd for his flock. Xenophon, also in his Cyropaedia, presented Cyrus to the future Greek conqueror of Asia as the ideal of the world ruler, thus representing monarchy as the justest form of government, because it alone, in contrast to the dreary mechanical leveling of democracies, knew how to estimate individual achievements on the principle sumque. Plato, in his Politicus, found the ideal of the absolute monarchy of the wise man, which was difficult of realization, but finally in his laws he gave the preference to the monarch bound by the laws and ruling constitutionally. And what a strong interest he felt in monarchy as actually existing is shown by his repeated visits to Syracuse and his zealous but ineffectual endeavors to ennoble its government. At an advanced age, Isocrates, the great political pamphleteer, associated himself with those who saw in monarchy a cure for the miseries of the day. In his writings addressed to the Cypriot prince Nicholas in the 70s of the 4th century, he spoke quite plainly of the advantages of monarchy, but maintained that the Greeks themselves could not endure a king. It was precisely this monarchical idea which led him in the end to Philip. Even in these politically dismal days of the 4th century, Greek civilization continued the great traditions of the 5th century and was in full flower. Both in the intellectual and artistic spheres, it produced wonderful achievements which are immortal. Athens, in particular, notwithstanding its political collapse at the end of the Peloponnesian War, still maintained the leading central position, which it had won in the 5th century from Ionia. If Attic civilization took on a pan-Hellenic character, the Attic Empire of the 5th century, in spite of its short duration, contributed not a little to this result. From Athens, the head of an empire over hundreds of tributary cities, a broad stream of Attic civilization had flowed in Hellas, and throughout the islands and coast of the Aegean Sea. Attic law and Attic institutions, Attic speech and customs had spread far, especially in Ionia. But this influence was not confined to the empire. As Athens, with its harbor the Piraeus, had become the economic center not merely of the Allies but of the Greek world, it had also, as the center of civilization, exercised a magnetic attraction on prominent intellectuals and artists from all parts. Sophistic found its center in Athens, worked in Attic speech, and even helped to construct the artistic Attic prose style, though scarcely a single sophist was a native of Athens. All these influences had gone too deep to be removed by the collapse of the empire. Isocrates, the master of the new oratorical style, was able to boast in his Panegyrics 380 that his native city had so outdistanced other men in thinking and speaking, in philosophy and rhetoric, that her scholars had become the teachers of others. That she had caused the term Hellene to signify the longer racial descent, but mode of thought, and that those called Hellenes were those who partook of Attic culture rather than those who had a common descent. This means that Isocrates saw the true Hellene only in the Greek educated on the Attic model, and thus narrowed the concept of Hellene, but it does not mean, as it is usually assumed, that he regarded barbarians of Attic education as Hellenes. This latter idea, which changes the race contrast of Hellene and barbarian into a contrast of civilizations, was quite alien to him, by reason of his hatred for Persia. The hereditary foe, which he gives sharp expression in the same treatise. Indeed, it has only manifested itself in the Hellenistic age after the establishment of Alexander's world empire. Yet, when Isocrates wrote, there were already many barbarians more or less influenced by Greek civilization, and in the next decade it penetrated further into non-Greek areas, in some parts very thoroughly, insofar as this phenomenon had its cause in a capacity in need of expansion possessed by Greek civilization. It is of the greatest importance for the understanding of Alexander's work. He gave these forces undreamt of possibilities of actualization, but the phenomenon has other causes as well. One was the hopeless condition of the mother country, which drove out many vigorous elements to seek their fortune abroad. We have spoken already of the masses who went overseas to serve as mercenaries in Asia Minor, or Egypt, for or against the great king. Grievous as their loss was to the mother country, these many thousands of mercenaries who lived abroad for decades were bound, consciously or unconsciously, to contribute to the spread of Greek customs and life in foreign lands. On the other hand, these Greeks from the most different cantons of the mother country lived together in military units, and so could not but prepare for that leveling of local peculiarities, which was completed after Alexander. It not merely mercenaries and traders, however, whom necessity sent abroad, but artists also who could find no commissions in their impoverished homes. In the Peloponnese, where the school of Sicyon was flourishing, we hear at the beginning of this period of works like the famous temple of Athena, Alea at Tegea, built by Scopas and renowned for its size and beauty, and the fine new buildings at the Hieron and Epidaurus. But Athens was then so poor that only necessary buildings were in question, and thus we often meet with Attic artists abroad. This supply from Hellas found a corresponding demand, for the satraps and dynasts of Asia Minor desired to adorn their cities with Greek art and to attract Greek poets, musicians, and orators to their courts. The cause of this phenomenon, which has been rightly regarded as another precursor of Hellenism, is to be found in the fact that for centuries Greek civilization, proceeding from Ionia, had deeply penetrated Lydia, Caria, and Lycia, kindling the ambitions of their self-conscious dynasts. The most powerful of them all was Mausolus of Caria. He enlarged the seat of government, Halicarnassus, by forcibly increasing its population, Synekiismos, and had it adorned by Greek artists with fine palaces and temples. An admirer of Greek culture, he made his court a court of the Muses by summoning Greek artists and poets. When he died in 352, his widow, Artemisia, held a competition of Greek poets and rhetoricians at his funeral, and began the erection of the gigantic tomb, which he had perhaps himself planned. It was counted among the 7 wonders of the world, and called the mausoleum, a term still applied to large tombs, as it was in the latter days of antiquity. This wonderful building was the work of the foremost artists of the Greek world, the architecture being by Pythias and Satyrus, and the sculptured decoration by Scopas and Leocharis, Timotheus and Braxias. Another Eastern example of Greek art of this period is offered by the fine marble sarcophagi, made by Attic artists for the 4th century kings of Sidon. But probably the most striking instance of the introduction of Greek culture into these lands is afforded by a unimportant Persian vassal, Hermias of Atanias in the Troad, who lived on terms of intimacy with the Platonists Erastus and Corsicus, and in gratitude assigned to them his town of Assos. After the death of Plato, Aristotle settled there, and spent 3 important years of his life in research and teaching, in close friendship with Hermias. While we can observe the beginnings of a quiet and peaceful penetration of Greek culture in the East, as also in Italy and Carthage in the West, the idea of a national war of the united Greeks against Persia arose at the same time and was vigorously propagated. This pan-Hellenic idea, as we call the essential feature of the movement, is of fundamental importance for the understanding of Philip and Alexander. For it was they who, in the interest of their policy, finally adopted the conception and in their own manner put it into execution. The old thought of an opposition between Hellene and barbarian awoke to new life. In the Great Persian War, it had been the expression of that strong self-conscious national feeling, which had largely contributed to the amazing advance of the nation in the 5th century. This opposition was bound to be felt more keenly by those who were striving to avert the constant internecine wars of Greeks, when, after 412, Persia had again begun to interfere with the history of Greece, nor were they led astray by the fact that in the meantime the sophists, starting from the law of nature, had proclaimed the equality of all men, and therefore of Hellenes and barbarians. It was the distress of the moment that drove men to adopt the pan-Hellenic idea. The first to proclaim it publicly was the eloquent Gorgias, who, when the Greeks were assembled for the Olympic Games, unfortunately, we do not know for certain in what year, urged them to concord, homonia, and war against Persia, and called on them to choose not Greek cities but the territory of the barbarians as the prize for which they fought. It was a war of conquest against Persia, which was demanded, a necessary preliminary being concord among the Greeks themselves. The pan-Hellenic program of Gorgias was frequently handled by rhetoricians after him, and we are justified in the conclusion that it aroused the interest of the public. But it was first raised to historical significance by Isocrates, the pupil of Gorgias, whose extraordinary importance as a political writer has only recently been recognized, though his oratorical skill has never been questioned. In the year 380, 6 years after the king's peace, he produced his Panegyricus, a masterpiece of epidactic oratory, which established his fame as the first political writer of the day. In form, it was a speech before the Olympic festal gathering, after the model of Gorgias. In reality, it was a pamphlet, which was circulated and read throughout Greece. Starting from the pan-Hellenic program, the reconciliation of the Greeks with the object of a united national war against Persia, Isocrates answered the question not yet treated by his predecessors: who was to lead this campaign? By the double answer, Athens and Sparta, who were first to be reconciled for the purpose. By depicting at length, however, the great services which Athens had rendered to Hellas, he sought finally to show that Athens had the higher claim to the sole leadership. To be sure, Athens must first of all once more control the seas, and with this in view he very cleverly threw out the idea of a new Attic naval league. But he justified the national war, which he, like Gorgias, regarded as a war of conquest, not only by the material consequences of the victory, the rich acquisition of territory in Asia would transfer the wealth of Asia to Greece, and the poverty of Greece, this root of all internecine disputes, would be abolished, but also, from the standpoint of national honor, by the demand that the shameful king's peace should be cancelled and the Greeks of Asia Minor set free. The ultimate good of the war, however, was that by sharing the danger and gains the Greeks themselves would secure a permanent peace. His propaganda was brilliantly successful so far as it concerned Athens' new sea power. For 3 years later, and certainly in part owing to the influence he had exercised on public opinion, the Second Attic Naval League was founded. On the other hand, the idea of a reconciliation between Athens and Sparta, and the sharing of leadership on sea and land, which he had urged almost as zealously, was demonstrated to be utopian. It was still more inconceivable that Sparta would resign the supreme command to Athens alone. In the following years, as the antagonisms of the leading states showed themselves even more acutely, Isocrates soon recognized that Hellas of herself would never arrive at internal peace, and therefore fulfilled the conditions for a general national war. The particularism represented by the ideal of the free and independent polis was too deeply engraved in the Greeks, so he, like many others as we saw, turned to the monarchical solution and looked round the fringes of the Greek world for a strong man, who was not tied to the laws and constitution of a polis, and had the power and inclination to realize the pan-Hellenic idea. He presented his program to several rulers successfully, to Jason of Pherae, the forceful unifier of Thessaly, who was credited with aiming at a war with Persia, and afterward to Dionysius I, the great ruler of the West, but the former was murdered soon afterwards in 370, and the latter, for whom such plans were too remote, soon died 367. Isocrates, however, could wait. In spite of his disappointments, in spite of his renunciation of Attic sea power in the oration on the peace of 355, to which he was brought by the failure of the social war, he adhered tenaciously to the pan-Hellenic idea. Meanwhile, he lived to see the powerful expansion of Macedonia under King Philip, and perceived there in the north a great power arising. In 346, therefore, when, after many years of war, Athens concluded the peace of Philocrates with the Philip on the basis of the status quo, the old man, who was then 90, in great joy at the final restoration of peace, took up his pen and in his Philip indited an open letter to the king, laying before him his pan-Hellenic program with the invitation to reconcile the Greeks and lead them against Persia, the traditional foe. Who was this Philip, that from him Isocrates could hope for the fulfillment of his desires? Chapter 2. Philip II of Macedonia. The beginnings of Macedonian history are shrouded in complete darkness. There is keen controversy on the ethnological problem, whether the Macedonians were Greek or not. Linguistic science has at its disposal a very limited quantity of Macedonian words, and the archaeological exploration of Macedonia has hardly begun. And yet, when we take into account the political conditions, religion, and morals of the Macedonians, our conviction is strengthened that they were a Greek race and akin to the Dorians. Having stayed behind in the extreme north, they were unable to participate in the progressive civilization of the tribes, which went further south, and so, when in the time of the Persian Wars they emerged on the horizon of the other Greeks, they appeared to them as non-Greeks, as barbarians. When Alexander I of Macedon, who, though a vassal of Xerxes, had in the Persian War given many proofs of his sympathy with the Greek cause, desired to take part in the Olympic Games, to which only Hellenes had access. He was at first refused as a barbarian, and it was only when by a bold fiction he traced back the pedigree of his house, the Argadai, to the Heraclid Temenus of Argos, that he was admitted as a competitor. Since then, the kings of Macedonia passed with the Greeks as Hellenes, and as descendants of Heracles. But, as before, so afterwards, the people were regarded as barbarians, even by Isocrates and his Philip, though, in the meantime, many kings had done much for the introduction of Greek culture into their country. Even in Philip's day, the Greeks saw in the Macedonians a non-Greek foreign people, and we must remember this if we are to understand the history of Philip and Alexander, and especially the resistance and obstacles which met them from the Greeks. The point is much more important than our modern conviction that Greeks and Macedonians were brethren. This was equally unknown to both, and therefore could have no political effect. Quite apart from the local separation of these two peoples, the barbaric impressions which the Macedonians made on the Greeks is explained by the close relationship in which the Macedonians lived for centuries with their barbarian neighbors, the Illyrians, the ancestors of the Albanians of today, in the west, and the Thracians in the east, even the level land of Lower Macedonia, north of Mount Olympus, on the lower course of the rivers Halcomon and Axios, into which the Macedonians penetrated in their eastward advance from Mount Bermius, out of the mountainous country of Upper Macedonia. was then occupied in its western parts by Illyrians, and in its eastern by Thracians. The Macedonians had to win it gradually from them by fighting. This is proved by the names of the two Macedonian capitals, Agai and Pella, which are Macedonian translations of the original Illyrian names Edessa, Water City, and Bonamos. Though most of the ancient inhabitants were expelled, yet certainly, as generally happens, many stayed behind, and in course of time, at any rate in civilization, were assimilated to the lower classes of the conquerors. The same thing happened with the Greeks who went farther south, and the original Anatolian population they found there. A strong Illyrian and Thracian influence can thus be recognized in Macedonian speech and manners. These, however, are only trifles compared with the Greek character of the Macedonian nationality. For example, the names of the true full-blooded Macedonians, especially of the princes and nobles, are purely Greek in their formation and sounds. Above all, the fundamental features of Macedonian political institutions are not only Greek, but primitive Greek. The old patriarchal monarchy over people and army lasted here down to the days of Philip and Alexander, a monarchy such as had once existed in all Greek tribes, until it had to give way to aristocratic forms of government under the dissolving influence of the polis. One of the factors which explain the tenacious retention of the old monarchy is that the progressive idea of the polis had not entered Macedonia. Another point is that the power of the king, who was supreme general, judge, and priest, was tempered by the fact that the old Greek community in arms, in whose eyes the king was primus inter pares, which had once existed in primitive times among the Greeks, maintained itself down to Alexander's day and beyond, in the assembly of the army, which was possessed of definite privileges. This assembly of the army, though bound to the hereditary right of the Argead house, had the right and duty of electing the new king, that is, of confirming him by acclamation. None was counted as lawful king but he whom the assembly of the army had recognized. A further right which it possessed was that trials for high treason had to be conducted before it. It dealt with both sentence and execution. In other respects, the king was the representative of justice, and his subjects appealed to him with their affairs in personal audience, in truly patriarchal fashion. But the Argeads were not at first lords of the whole Macedonian nation. Originally the tribes of Upper Macedonia, the Lasante, Aristai, and Alamatai had their own princes or kings. Tedious struggles were necessary to incorporate them into the Macedonian state, and it is likely that the mediatization of these princely houses was only completed under Philip, by whose hand the unified Macedonian state was thus constituted. The army consisted originally of the nobility attached to the land, who were bound to serve their prince or king on horseback. Their personal relation to the king was expressed by the patriarchal title of heteroi, the king's followers, a title which again recalls the conditions of early Hellas. The 2,500 myrmidons of Achilles are called in the Iliad his heteroi. When the king formed a council of several of these heteroi, the members were called the heteroi of the royal entourage. But this was not the origin of the title, as has recently been supposed. The old Homeric title of honor persisted in Macedonia for centuries, as applied to the noble following of the king. It is typical of the relationship of the king of the nobility, that he was not distinguished from them by dress. He had no special royal emblems, and the purple of the calmus, mantle, and the cosia, a broad-brimmed hat, were also worn by the nobility. Besides this noble cavalry, the free peasants and shepherds may have come in disorderly bodies from time to fight, but it is only in the 4th century that they appear to have been organized into a regular infantry, recruited and arranged, like the cavalry, according to districts. Thereafter the honorable title of heteroi was given to the infantry also, in the form pesahadoroi, foot companions. According to an ambiguous statement, this was done under Philip's elder brother Alexander. Perhaps, however, it was completed only on Philip's reorganization of the army. At any rate, The introduction of the title pes heteroi denoted that the infantry henceforth came into the same personal relation to the king, which the noble cavalry had long enjoyed. In this one may trace a statesman-like move of approximation to the lower classes of the people, such as could only secure and raise the power of the king. It was probably only after the grant of the title of pes heteroi that the infantry were allowed to participate in the assembly of the army and its privileges. With the grant of rights and liberties, the Macedonian monarchy was firmly based on the people. If at times there was friction between the king and the proud nobility, on the whole, the Macedonians were loyal to their king and showed him due respect. It was customary for the soldier to take off his helmet while he was speaking to his king, while on the other hand the king was on terms of comradeship with his officers. The Macedonians were a thoroughly healthy people, trained not by Greek athletics, but, like the Romans, by military service. But alongside much that was good, they had many rougher habits, retained from earlier times, such as excessive drinking, which tended to make them appear as barbarians in Greek eyes. The dislike was reciprocal, for the Macedonians had grown into a proud, masterful nation, which, with highly developed national consciousness, looked down upon the Hellenes with contempt. This fact, too, is of prime importance for the understanding of later history. The further advance of the eastern frontier of Macedonia, which under Alexander I had reached the river Struma, had been stopped by the brilliant development of Athens at the head of the Delian League. Athens established itself on the north coast of the Aegean, including the Macedonian coast, made subject the cities on the peninsula of Chalcidice, and finally founded the colony of Amphipolis near the mouth of the Strymon, which soon rose to great prosperity. But when the terrible disaster in Sicily, 413, caused the collapse of Athens as a great power, and Macedonia, like other states, found fresh scope, Archelaus, who then ascended the throne, used the situation to give his state an enhanced military and political importance. He built fortresses and military roads, and he fundamentally reorganized the army, paying special attention to the equipment of the cavalry. In Thucydides' judgment, he did more than his 8 predecessors put together. His interference in the conflicts of the Thessalian nobility bore witness to the increased striking power of Macedonia. He also has the merit of having labored to introduce Greek culture into his country, even more thoroughly than was attempted by Alexander I, the Philhellene. At his court and the new capital, Pella, he succeeded in developing a rich intellectual life by inviting there the most famous poets and artists of his day. Euripides spent with him the last years of his life, and there wrote the Bacchae, in honor of his royal patron, the Archelaus. And Timotheus, also, who was then highly celebrated as musician and poet, was one of his guests, and he caused his palace at Pella to be decorated with paintings by Xerxes. At Dion, in Piera, under Mount Olympus, where there was an old cult of the Muses, he established scenic contests in honor of Olympian Zeus and the Muses. We do not hear what attitude the Macedonian nobles adopted to this introduction of Greek culture by their king, which makes us think of the later courts of the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander. It is possible that it was not easy to reconcile them to it, but subsequent history shows that the seed was not sown in vain. The position of prestige won by Archelaus was short-lived. After his murder in 399, began a calamitous period of 40 years. Severe fighting within and without, rival candidates for the throne, and incursions from Illyria and Thrace so weakened the Macedonian state that it finally became dependent on the successive predominant powers of Greece, and under Amyntas, a tributary to the Illyrians, the very existence of the state was at stake. When in 359, King Perdiccas, the son of Amyntas, was defeated by the Illyrians in a great battle, and slain with 4,000 of his men, on all sides the enemy poured into the country, and no less than 3 pretenders, supported by foreign powers, rose against Philip, the youngest brother of Perdiccas, who, as regent, took the reins of government on behalf of his nephew Amyntas, the young son of Perdiccas. At this most critical moment of Macedonian history, Philip, who was then 24, acted with astounding energy and skill. By brilliant feats of arms and by most subtle and cunning diplomatic skill, he promptly succeeded in removing perils from without and within, and was soon acclaimed king by the Macedonian army. In the first year of his reign, Philip had already reached the height of his powers. His extraordinary capabilities as general, statesman, and diplomat, which made possible this rapid and thorough salvation of the state, explained to us also the extraordinary success of his career. Yet the greatness of this man was not understood till the 19th century. Not merely was his fame obscured by the glittering achievements of his son Alexander, his memory has suffered from the disadvantage too. The greatest orator, produced by Greece, Demosthenes, was his political opponent, passionately attacked him in his incomparable speeches, and in the interest of his policy, presented to the Athenians a picture, distorted by hatred, of Philip the barbarian. In the age of classicism especially, everyone was dazzled by the fine periods of the Demosthenes, and, accepting them literally, judged the life work of Philip purely from the Athenian standpoint, and that too from the standpoint of Demosthenes. This was accentuated by the political tendencies of the period. Barthold George Niebuhr had a passionate hatred for Philip, in whom, with his vivid conception of history, he saw a parallel to Napoleon, and before Austerlitz published a translation of the first Philippic of Demosthenes, to produce a political effect against the Gallus rebellis, as is shown by the motto he affixed to it. To reach a just estimate of Philip, historical science had first to be liberated from the Athenian Demosthenic point of view. It is modern research alone that, following the lead of J.G. Droysen, has tended more and more to set out from the one correct point of view. The Macedonian king Philip must be judged by the standard of Macedonian interests only. If we do this, Philip stands before us as one of the great rulers of the world's history, not only because he laid the foundations for the exploits of his still greater son Alexander, on which Alexander, in conformity with his own genius, erected a new world, but also as a man in himself of far-seeing aims and achievements. There is no space here to explain in detail how Philip, starting from the little country he found, made gradual advance in each quarter, how in the west he fought the Illyrians and won influence over Epirus, how in the east he fought against the Thracians, in the north reached the Danube, and in the south secured by fighting the coast so essential for Macedonia's development, and the Chalcidic peninsula as well, won Thessaly, and intervened ever more decisively in Greek affairs. All those undertakings, which show him in kaleidoscope fashion active now here, now there, are only reflections of one great idea, which possessed him quite early, perhaps from the start, to make his Macedonian people master of the whole Balkan peninsula. This imperialistic program was raised to a higher level by his policy of introducing Greek culture more thoroughly, and so making Macedonia a really civilized state. It was this that gave his vigorous imperialism its deeper character. The example of Archelaus has been followed by Perdiccas, who at his court associated with the Platonist Euphorius, and learned from him geometry and philosophy. Philip too attracted many prominent Greeks to his court. He had the very successful idea of inviting Aristotle to educate the successor to the throne, and took a step at the utmost moment in the adaptation of Hellenic culture in his own country. He introduced the language of Athens into his chancery, and both in administration and in the formation of his military systems followed Greek models. Though only isolated features of these endeavors have come down to us, they point plainly to his principal intention, the intensified Hellenization of his country. This civilizing policy had a consequence. If it was part of Philip's plan to dominate not merely the main mass of the Balkan Peninsula, but Hellas as well, he could not incorporate Greeks, as he did Illyrians and Thracians, into his Macedonian empire. He must look for some formula of association which would save the face of the Greeks and make their position tolerable. He was certainly clear that the control of Greece would necessarily involve him in a conflict with the Persian Empire. For by the king's peace, it was the Persian king to whom belonged the control and supremacy of Hellas. On the other hand, if Philip wanted to win Thrace and the north coast of the Propontis and Bosphorus, it could not but appear to him desirable, nay, even essential, in order to secure this important waterway, to extend and round off his empire on the coast of Asia Minor, and this could not be done without war with Persia. In view of the appeal of Isocrates, it may be started with confidence that from early days, alongside the immediate aim of securing the Balkan Peninsula. He was also possessed by the idea, if only as a distant goal, of a Hellenic combination and a war against Persia. It is a matter of course that Philip, a master of diplomacy, kept all those ideas and plans for the future locked up in his own breast, but if he was to execute them, he required an army which would be ready to strike. No doubt both with barbarians and even more with Greeks, he often accomplished his objects by bribery. But in the main he owed his success to his good sword. His reorganization of the Macedonian army is a real work of genius. As he was the creator of the army system which Alexander took over, some account must be given of it. It is significant that Philip in his youth lived for 3 years in Thebes as a hostage, and thus became acquainted with the strategic methods of Epimenides. When he came to the throne, he took over and made the starting point of his reorganization the oblique order of battle, an invention Epimenides which caused a revolution in tactics. Hitherto, the Greeks had usually fought in parallel lines. Epimenides divided his front into offensive and a defensive wing in order to decide his battles. The former wing was unusually deep, as previously had sometimes been the case in Boeotia, and was formed of the best troops. Its task was to advance to a concentrated attack, break through, and bring about a decision, while the weaker wing moved forward slowly and remained more on the defensive, so that at the moment of conflict, the front of the battle line was in fact oblique, as the ancients called the formation. Epimenides, who formed both wings out of the heavy infantry. His cavalry served only to protect the flanks, fixed on the left wing for the attack, as hitherto in parallel battle formations the decision had generally been attempted by both sides on the right wing. His attack with the left had all the more the effect of surprise. These tactics which gave Epimenides the victory of Leuctra and Mantinea were now adopted by Philip, but modified in correspondence with the different constitution of his Macedonian army. He assigned the offensive to his excellent cavalry, the heteroi, and the defensive to the infantry phalanx, which he created with this object. He did not confine the offensive to one wing, but launched his cavalry attacks sometimes on the right wing, and sometimes, as at Karanai, on the left, probably according to the peculiarities of the ground or the nature of the hostile position. To carry out these tactics, he had fundamentally to reorganize his army. The mounted squadrons which he took over, he transformed into regular cavalry, dividing it into regiments, ilae, tactical units, which were recruited according to districts. These heteroi were armed with helmet, corselet, and sword, and fought with a thrusting spear of dogwood. As stirrups were not yet invented, they could not, like the riders of the Middle Ages, by pressing the spear under the arm, increase the force of the thrust by pressure on the stirrups, but had to wield their spears with a free hand, as appears from the mosaic representing Alexander in battle. The reorganization of the infantry was yet more thorough. Whether and how far before Philip there was any organized foot at all, which could be called infantry, is debatable, as was stated above in discussion of the name Pezhatoroi. At any rate, Philip was the creator of the famous Macedonian phalanx. In order to carry out the oblique formation, it was essential to create infantry suitable for the defensive wing. This explains the peculiar equipment and use of phalangites, on the pattern of the light-armed peltist introduced by the Athenian Ithracites, who were armed with long spears, and only a small round shield, pelta. Philip gave his phalangites as chief weapon, besides the sword, much longer and heavier spears, the saracei, and also, in addition to a small pelta carried by a ring on the arm, a helmet, greaves, and probably metal protected jerkins of leather as well. They were accordingly a cross between heavy hoplites and peltists, better suited for slow advance and the sustaining of attacks than for quick movements, though in case of necessity capable of executing the latter, drawn up in thick formation of regiments, taxias. In battle they had, on the defensive wing, to follow slowly the attack of the cavalry and detain the enemy. By their side, Philip also had a light-armed infantry, the hypaspists, whose battle role was to hasten forward at quick march, or the double, and make connection between the cavalry and the phalanx. This was the Macedonian kernel of the army, but it was supplemented later by auxiliary troops from Thrace and other neighboring barbarian countries. Philip occupies a prominent place in the history of the art of war, by being the first to combine all classes of fighters into one tactical unit. he also marks a turning point in the development of strategy, for he was the first, if the intention is not to be ascribed to Epaminondas, who, with a view to the total destruction of the enemy, consciously carried out the strategy of defeat, as it is usually called, after the classical book of General von Clausewitz, Vom Krieg, whereas earlier battles were usually regarded by the Greeks as competitions, the victor being he who kept the battlefield and erected a trophy, while the defeated side retired. Philip, after winning a victory, put himself at the head of his cavalry and pursued the fleeing enemy to the last breath of man and horse. What a wild chase that was, is shown by a statement that has recently come down to us, according to which, after a victorious battle with the Triballi, Philip, in pressing the pursuit, was accidentally wounded in the leg by the spear of one of his own followers. Philip also marks an epoch in the art of besieging towns. The old method of starving the enemy out was not good enough for the introducer of the strategy of defeat. He was the first to employ the East siege engines, such as Dionysius I of Syracuse had constructed by Greek and Carthaginian engineers. His sieges of Perinthus and Byzantium, 340, though unsuccessful, were epoch-making in the science. On account of the impression caused by this revolution in the conduct of sieges, Athens and other cities began to convert their walls into stone in place of the brick that had hitherto sufficed. It is obvious that all these innovations, especially the execution of the oblique battle formation, required far greater training of the troops, so they were well drilled and exercised for fighting, marching, and maneuvering. As Demosthenes recognized with admiration, summer or winter, day or night made no difference to Philip's operations. While in the Greek free states the citizens were generally above submitting to military exercises, and preferred to hire mercenaries, the Macedonians, noble and peasant alike, followed with enthusiasm their king, who led them from victory to victory, and as was shown by the scars which covered his body, himself shared in all their perils and fatigues. In particular, Philip succeeded in attaching his officers to his person by the institution of the corps of royal pages, by giving these noble youths who personally attended the monarch a physical and intellectual training at court. He created a sort of cadet corps for his officers. He was also a means of attaching permanently to the interests of the court the Macedonian nobility, which in earlier days had often been malcontent. But in other respects than in the military sphere, this monarchy was superior to the Greek polis in striking power. Not only was the supreme command in the king's hands, but also the sole conduct of foreign policy. While in the free states, torn by internal factions, questions of foreign policy were decided now in this way, now in that, by decisions of the majority after long contradictory speeches of demagogues. In the Macedonian monarchy, the king alone had the decision. This, too, Demosthenes recognized as a great advantage for his opponent. A steady, uniform, far-sighted policy could be formed. Plan and executive were in the same hands, and statesmen in general were united in one man. Such was the powerful position of the prince, to whom Isocrates in 346, in his Philip, commended the execution of his Pan-Hellenic program. In the first part of the treatise, he deals with the reconciliation of the Greek states, which, as Gorgias and he himself in his Panegyrics 380 had shown, was a necessary preliminary to a common military enterprise. He made the practical proposal to Philip that he should first reconcile with one another the four leading states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Argos, who would confer with him by their ambassadors, and then the small states would of themselves follow the example set. For him, as a descendant of Heracles, it would not be difficult, as each of these great states had some connection with his ancestor Heracles. Their desperate condition would make them incline to a peaceful agreement, and Philip would win glory and goodwill throughout Greece. In the second part of the treatise, he discusses the war with Persia. The moment was as favorable as possible, since the Persian Empire was effectively weakened by the revolt of large territories. Philip need only go over to Asia Minor and proclaim liberty, and many of the satraps would greet him as their friend in need and throw off allegiance to the great king. Here, too, Isocrates points to his ancestor Heracles, who once overcame Troy in a few days, and Philip might well rival him in philanthropy and goodwill to the Greeks. If practicable, he should destroy the whole Persian monarchy. But if this was not possible, He should cut off hither Asia Minor from Cilicia to Sinope, settle in colonies the homeless wanderers who were a terror to Hellas, and thus secure Greece by erecting a bulwark against the east. If this also was impossible, he should at least liberate the Greeks of Asia Minor from the Persian yoke. He was sure of the greatest glory and gratitude of the Greeks. Isocrates ends with the warning that Philip should be to Greeks a benefactor, to Macedonians a king, not a tyrant, and that he should liberate the barbarians from barbaric despotism and admit them to Hellenic care and protection. The modern reader will notice with surprise how full this treatise on practical politics is of arguments drawn from mythical history, and in particular from the legend of Heracles. But in order to understand the Greeks of this age, one must enter into the peculiarity of their mentality. As Jacob Burckhardt once formulated it, the myth was the ideal basis of their whole existence. Even in the most sober political questions, it was quite useful to refer to mythical parallels, or even, as Isocrates did here in part, to shape the myths in the interest of the present and to project into mythical times views of the present in order to give them more force. In Alexander's own life, this practice played a great part, when Isocrates in this treatise makes so much of Heracles as Philip's ancestor. This was meant not merely for Philip, but for the Greek public as well. For this open letter to the king, which was also circulated as a pamphlet throughout Greece, was intended to have a double effect, on Philip to influence him to be the leader in the national war, and on the Greeks to prepare public opinion for his leadership. The strong emphasis on Philip as Heraclid, and therefore a true Hellene, was to make easier for Greeks the idea of subordination to foreign leadership. When Philip read the book, the insistence on his descent from Heracles must have been welcome to him, for in his policy, he had to stress this mythical derivation, as the types of Heracles on his coins show. But on the other hand, he must have smiled at the naivety shown by Isocrates. What was according to Isocrates to be the result of this war waged by Philip against Persia with his Macedonians and the united Greeks? He was to serve exclusively Greek interests. The Greeks of Asia Minor were to be liberated. Asia Minor colonized with the homeless Greeks in order to free Greece from its grave economic and social distress. It was the Greeks that the riches and plenty of the East were to benefit. Only faintly, and in general terms, was it indicated that Philip would also win power and riches, but solely in order to recommend to him instead, as a higher aim, glory and the goodwill of the Greeks. Isocrates must have taken this strong realist for an idealist, such as he was himself, if he believed that Philip would draw his sword for the Buyuks of the Greeks. He judged Philip as wrongly in the one direction as did Demosthenes in the other by thinking that Philip aimed at the total destruction of Athens. If Isocrates had known the secret plans of Philip's Macedonian policy, he could never have written his Philip. And yet it is of the greatest historical importance that he turned to Philip, for it is unmistakable that he influenced Philip's subsequent procedure. Though these suggestions of a fulfillment of purely Greek desires may have appeared strange to Philip, whose policy was purely Macedonian, the Philip as a whole unquestionably made a deep impression on him. He certainly greeted it with joy. It was a great moral success, which might materially benefit his secret plans, that this distinguished publicist and professor, who had the greatest influence on the public opinion of the whole Greek world, should call on him to take the lead in the pan-Hellenic national war which many Hellenes had long desired. Philip no doubt at once recognized that ideas were proposed to him which had the closest contact with his secret plans and ideas. He needed but to modify these plans cleverly, in order to conceal his Macedonian aims with pan-Hellenic catchwords. The chief difference between his own plans and the program of Isocrates was that he himself in the last resort contemplated the domination of Greece in effect, if not in appearance, in order to lead a Macedonian war of conquest against Persia, and so round off his empire, while Isocrates regarded the reconciliation of the Greek states merely as a presupposition of the national war. The Philip has often been interpreted in the sense that Isocrates recommended to the king a union of the Greek nation into one state, either a federal state or a league of states with Philip at its head. And it has consequently been held that Philip afterward at Corinth carried out this idea of Isocrates. But actually, there is no trace in the treatise of such a view. Isocrates never for an instant thought of a politically unified state under Philip's leadership. It is simply the internal unification of Hellas, which he calls on Philip to bring about, the concord, homonoia, of the Greek polis, which is to be effected by the reconciliation, dialysis, of existing antagonisms. It is equally an error to believe that the pan-Hellenic idea started with the object of the union of the nation into one state, and to compare Isocrates and the representatives of this idea to the men of 1848, who prepared the ground for German unity. In reality, nothing more is implied either in Gorgias or in the Panegyrics of Isocrates than the reconciliation and internal accord of the Greeks. Actually, both in the 4th century and previously, the Greek people had no conception of a national unified state. This conception, which is so familiar to us today, should not be important to Greek history, and taken as a standard of judgment in estimating the political performances of the nation. As Hellenes, the Greeks felt themselves united merely by their common civilization, and on this their national feeling rested. While Isocrates considered as possible an internal reconciliation of all Greeks by Philip, the statesman Philip could not fail to see at once that this was the dream of an idealist. In fact, when one takes a retrospect of the passionate internal struggles of the previous decades, in which the Greeks tore each other in pieces, one cannot conceive how Isocrates arrived at this belief. By friendly persuasion, such as he envisaged, nothing was to be done. Compulsion alone could avail, but this course assumed that Philip should first carry out his plan of dominating Greece. Only then could he attempt to attain peaceful conditions there. The invitation of Isocrates, therefore, can merely have confirmed him in his old plan of hegemony over Greece. Far off as it was, on the other hand, he could immediately adopt the second point of Isocrates' program and take over the leadership in the pan-Hellenic national war. This was no doubt uncommonly desirable to him. He could cover his long-contemplated Macedonian war of conquest in Asia with the pan-Hellenic flag, and thus obtain a first-rate method both of winning the sympathies of the Greeks, which were extremely valuable to him because of his policy of culture, and of gaining a moral justification for his intended domination of Greece. How far Philip utilized for his policy the instigations of Isocrates was to appear in 338, when as visitor of Chaeronea, he organized Greece anew at Corinth and urged the Greeks to take up arms against Persia. Intervening events can only be briefly sketched. Philip's prestige in Greece was much enhanced by the successful termination, immediately after the peace of Philocrates and before the end of 346, of the war with the Phocians, the so-called Sacred War, which had devastated central Greece for 10 years. He forced the Phocians to capitulate, was admitted in their place into the Amphiotonic Council, and thus recognized as a Hellenic power. Soon afterwards, he won a dominant position in Thessaly by becoming Archon of the Thessalian League. In the following years, we see him fighting hard and pressing victoriously forward. After overcoming the Odrysian kingdom, securing his new territory by colonies such as Philippopolis, and extending his power to the Black Sea, he was brought by his effort to win the Thracian south coast into fresh collision with Athens, which, in the Thracian Chaeronea, had vital interest to maintain the security of the supply of grain from the Black Sea. The policy of Athens was then under the spell of the eloquence of Demosthenes, who, representing a specifically Athenian standpoint, had for many years seen in Philip the enemy of his native city, and finally did not hesitate to combine with Persia against him. Consequently, in Athens there was a violent clash of opinions. For the diametrically opposite view, the pan-Hellenic idea of a national war against Persia under the leadership of Philip was gaining ground, especially in intellectual circles, like the Academy, now directed by Plato's nephew, Specipipus, but the guidance of policy was in the hands of Demosthenes, and he urged Athens on to war. Though Philip, in the interest of his latent plans, earnestly endeavored to avoid, if possible, a conflict with Athens, and in spite of all provocation, was trying with inexhaustible patience to come to a peaceful understanding by diplomatic negotiations, albeit not without alarming Athens by his operations on the Cyrenaici and Bosphorus. Yet finally war broke out, and it was Athenian troops that in 340 forced him to raise the siege of Byzantium. Immediately before, his siege of Perinthus on the north coast of the Sea of Marmora had been upset by the intervention of a new enemy, Persia. Some years previously, with a view to the war against Persia, which he contemplated later, and as a preparation for crossing into Asia Minor, he had formed secret relations with Hermias of Altanias on the other side of the Dardanelles. But then, as a cunning diplomat concluded a treaty of amity with the Persian king, in order to lull the suspicions of his future enemy. In spite of that, the king caused his satraps to support the Perinthians against Philip, because he feared his establishment on the opposite Thracian coast. Though Philip felt irritated by the relief of Byzantium by Athens, still he avoided direct action against her, and to secure his Macedonian kingdom went off to the Dobruja to fight the Scythians and Triballians. It was only when the Amphiartonic Council gave him the command of a new sacred war against Amphissa that he moved into central Greece by way of Thermopylae. So finally in August 338, in the Boeotian plain of the Cephissus near Chaeronea, there was a great and decisive battle, and Philip completely defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Though, in view of the course which affairs had taken in Athens and all Greece for several decades, the policy of Demosthenes is open to the criticisms that in his Athenian aspirations, he did not take actual facts into account. Yet he will always remain as a conspicuous pattern of ardent patriotism, and it is a glorious page in the history of Athens, that under his guidance it remembered its proud past, and did not yield to superior force without a struggle. With emotion, we still read in the state cemetery of the Sarmaeus at Athens the lines inscribed on the grave of those who fell at Chaeronea. O time, not human can escape thy view. So tell to all what fate befell us too. How, striving on Boeotia's storied plain, to save our sacred Hellas, we were slain. Once more Philip won the battle of the Bleak Formation, the offensive on the left wing and the command of the cavalry he entrusted to his son Alexander, then 18 years old, while he himself led the defensive right wing. So, at the head of the Heteroi, the young Alexander charged the sacred band of the Thebans, while his father, facing the Athenians, kept back his phalanx and even at first retired for a short distance, to tempt them out of their advantageous position. After he had succeeded in this, he advanced victoriously, and, as Alexander in the meantime had routed the Thebans and wheeling to the right, was rolling up the enemy's center by a side attack, the victory was complete. It was an unusual action on Philip's part not to pursue the enemy after Chaeronea, but to stay on the battlefield, allowing them to retreat southwards. In this we see the man to whom, in the words of General von Clausewitz, war was only the continuation of policy by other means. The hour had now arrived for him to introduce the long-designed reorganization of Greece, the necessary condition of which was reconciliation with the Greeks. So to renounce the pursuit and annihilation of the enemy was a manifest gesture of a sincere desire for an accommodation. Here again, most plainly, we see the great advantage of the union of military command and political control in the person of the monarch, as compared with the strategoi of the polis, dependent on popular assemblies. Thebes had to pay indeed for the disappointment it had given Philip by joining with Athens. It had to submit to the restoration of Plataea and Orochomenus, and to the reception of a Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea. But to the Athenian Philip showed the greatest leniency. He restored to them their prisoners without ransom, caused the ashes of the dead to be taken to Athens in solemn procession by Antipater and Alexander, and offered friendship and alliance with the assurance that Athens should remain free and independent. They must, however, dissolve their naval league and give up the Thracian Chersonesi, for the loss of which the retrocession of Oropos was no compensation. The Athenians, before whose eyes Demosthenes had for years exhibited a caricature of Philip as the great brigand, whose sole aim was the destruction of Athens, had prepared for a desperate resistance. This leniency so surprised them that they had lost their heads in joy and gratitude. They granted Attic citizenship to Philip and his son Alexander, and erected a statue of the king at their agora. Even during the course of these negotiations for a separate peace with Athens, Philip slightly lifted the veil from his plans, in the clause in which he invited the Athenians, if they would, to accede to the universal peace, and to join the League Council, Sanhedrion, which he intended to institute. Moreover, to win Greek sympathies, he carefully circulated the rumor that he wished to lead Greece in a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia. When he moved his army from Athens into the Peloponnese, he was joyfully welcomed by the towns devoted to his cause, and separate peaces were concluded with those that had hitherto opposed him. Only Sparta refused to yield, and had to submit to a devastation of Laconia by Philip in conjunction with her old enemies, the Argives and Messenians, whereupon a general Greek court of arbitration awarded to those hostile neighbors all the boundary districts which Sparta had acquired in the course of centuries. Thus Philip had in fact become master of all Greece, and could now proceed to clothe his power with legal forms. With this object, he called on all the sovereign Greek states of the mainland up to the Macedonian frontier, and the islands as well, to send envoys to Corinth, to consult with him as to a new order of things in Greece. The Spartans, in spite of their political impotence, were the only state which proudly refused, and so at the end of 338 opened the memorable peace conference of Corinth, the decisions of which represent the crown of Philip's life work. We must consider them in detail, as they also formed the basis of Alexander's relation to Greece. Philip opened proceedings by reading a diagramma, a manifesto, in which he laid his proposals before the assembled envoys. No doubt in form, this recalls the fact that in this discussion of the king's peace at Sardis, a message of the great king was laid before the Greek representatives. But whereas they were then constrained by threats to accept what was dictated to them, in this case, Philip submitted his document only as a basis for the impending discussions. At any rate, they lasted 4 months, perhaps into the spring of 337. That the diagramma was couched in the most obliging forms is the more to be assumed, as Philip, so we are told, during the Congress exhibited to the envoys the full charm of his amiability, which he could show when he liked. He was most seriously anxious to win the sympathy of the Greeks, which was vital for the pursuance of his activities. The result of these negotiations was a treaty of alliance between Philip and the Greeks represented at Corinth, which was to be confirmed on oath by either side. Its chief points are as follows. Philip concluded with the Greeks amity and an offensive and defensive alliance, Samachia, forever. It is not certain, but not improbable, that even then, as at a later renewal of this treaty of alliance in 302, the Greek states at the same time agreed to friendship and an offensive and defensive alliance with one another. The League of Greeks formed by this alliance, styled the Hellenes, was represented in a general Sanhedrion, federal council, to which the individual states had to send their deputies, Synhedrioi, in number varying in proportion to their military strengths. This Synhedrion was to hold its ordinary sessions at the times and places of the 4 great pan-Hellenic festivals, at Olympia, Nemea, Delphi, and the isthmus. While for extraordinary meetings, Corinth was probably chosen, and it was there also that the necessary permanent business committee of 5 presidents, prohedoroi, no doubt sat. In the very first paragraph, freedom and autonomy, and probably also exemption from a tribute and military occupation, were granted to each individual member of the League, if, notwithstanding, apart from Thebes, Macedonian garrisons were placed also in Acrocorinth, Chalcis, and Ambracia. That was doubtless consequent on League interest and approved by the Congress. As in the Second Attic Naval League, the hegemony of Athens was outside the Synhedrion of the members, so here by the side of the Synhedrion, Philip was the hegemon, the federal general, elected for life by the Congress. His kingdom of Macedonia naturally did not belong to the Hellenic League. Rather, through Philip's position as hegemon, this Hellenic League of States, to whose individual members freedom and autonomy were guaranteed by treaty, was permanently connected with the kingdom of Macedonia by personal union. This, then, is the legal form which Philip finally found for his domination over Greece, so long pursued, a form, as one can see, which tried to deal as gently as possible with the Greek feeling of independence. What trouble he took to pay regard to Greek sensitivities is shown by the description of him in the treaty, not as king, but as hegemon. Functions were so divided between the Synhedrion and the hegemon that the former had to take resolutions and the latter to carry them out. To the Federal Council, which also formed the Federal Tribunal, very important discussions were assigned, as for example in the question whether measures should be taken against a transgressor of the treaty, that is on peace and war. In the latter case, the hegemon had to fix the contingents to be supplied by the members, and to conduct the war on behalf of the League. In accordance with the sense of the offensive and defensive alliance, he had, in such a case, to support the League with his Macedonian army, and vice versa the Greeks. If he was attacked, or an offensive war had to be carried on under his leadership, had to place their contingents under his command. With regard to the latter proviso, the same authority states that no one doubted that, by this, war with Persia was intended. This shows that Philip, for obvious military and political reasons, carefully avoided speaking officially of the Persian king during the constitutive session. In order not prematurely to irritate the king, he wanted to perfect his Greek League, and thus have firmly in hand the command of the Greek troops by land and sea, before he came out in public with the plan of a Persian war. Nevertheless, as it was necessary to fix the number of the representatives, he began by fixing officially the fighting strength of the individual members. It follows from the relative powers of both sides that as hegemon, Philip was not only a military leader of the League, but had also complete control of the foreign policy of the Greeks. In this manner, Philip united all the Greeks, with the single exception of Sparta, into a league of states, and so for the first time in history created a Greek unified state. Clearly, after what was said above about the pan-Hellenic idea, he was not, as has often been assumed, following the instigation of the Philip of Isocrates, which entertained no notion of a unification of Greece into one state. The creation of this Corinthian League was not a product of the pan-Hellenic idea, but of Philip's policy of raising the power of Macedonia. To realize this helps to explain the fact that this solution by Philip of the Greco-Macedonian question, in spite of his efforts to give it a shape which offended Greek susceptibilities as little as possible, was coldly received in wider circles than he had expected. The Greeks regarded the hegemony of Philip as, after all, a foreign domination. They did not look upon the Macedonians as Greeks. Though the League of States under Philip's guidance did not accord with the intentions of the Pan-Hellenists, yet we may recognize the influence of Isocrates in the universal peace proclaimed by Philip at the Congress. If the internal concord of the Greeks, as designed by Isocrates, was unrealizable, within the frame of the League of States thus created, measures could still be taken to secure tranquility and peace in the Greek world. Accordingly, provisions for a universal peace were included, as a vital and fundamental condition in the Treaty of Alliance. At first, it was a peace between Philip and the League. Thus, to take an instance, each member had to swear that he would not try to overthrow the monarchy of Philip and his descendants. The addition of the descendants shows that the treaty was eternal, for if it had merely been with Philip, the Greeks could not take over obligations to his descendants. It was of greater political importance, however, that the Greeks bound themselves by oath to keep the peace perpetually among themselves. No one member might engage in hostilities against another by land or sea. Piracy was forbidden to League members, and thus the freedom and security of the sea were placed under the protection of the League. Anyone who disobeyed was declared an enemy, and had to expect the punishment of his fellows. But peace was also to prevail within the states themselves. The Sanhedrion, in concert with representatives of the hegemon, had to see to it that no executions or sentences of exile were passed against the existing laws, and that there were no confiscations, distributions of land, cancellings of debts, or manumissions of slaves for revolutionary purposes, all the usual fearful accompaniments of the constant revolutions of the immediate past. Each member had to swear that he would not subvert the constitutions which existed in the states at the time when the oaths were taken. Many had been previously altered by Philip to suit his own views. We must not conclude that the object was to stifle all political life in the various cities. Only revolution by violence was forbidden. There was nothing at all to exclude a peaceful development of constitutional life. It was under this form of a universal peace that Philip sought to realize Isocrates' idea of reconciliation. The external and internal peace of the Allied states was guaranteed by severe sanctions contained in clauses of the treaty. To be sure, a real reconciliation of hearts would have been better. But this was utopian, as we have already observed, and it must be admitted that Philip's substitute of a compulsory peace was the only possible one under existing conditions. It at least promised a relief to the nation, if only it were treated in the spirit of Corinth. After the draft treaty had been unanimously adopted by the Congress, the envoys returned to their homes, and it was adopted and confirmed by oath everywhere. Elections of representatives immediately took place, for at the conclusion of the Congress, Philip had invited the council to sit as soon as possible, in order that he might address it on the interest of the League. So, the Federal Council held its first meeting at Corinth in the early summer of 337. The hour had come for Philip to strike the last great blow of his Macedonian policy of power. Now that he had the Greek contingents in hand, he could appear publicly with his long-cherished design of the Persian War. It was of great value to him that Isocrates, in his Philip, had prepared the public opinion of Greece for a pan-Hellenic national war under his leadership. He had now to utilize this pan-Hellenic idea in order to conceal his purely Macedonian aims. By leading in the war, he might hope to win the sympathies even of those Greeks who were opposed to him, and to acquire, even in their eyes, a moral title to the powerful status he had obtained at the Congress. He had a great position if he delivered the Greeks of Asia Minor from the Persian yoke, and therewith cancelled the first clause of the king's peace, which had weighed on Hellas for 50 years. The second clause of that peace he had already cancelled by diplomacy, for, according to the federal constitution, it was now Philip, and not the great king, who guaranteed the freedom and autonomy of the Greek states. But what reason was he to allege for the war with Persia? The simple and purely Greek motives of Isocrates were useless, nor could he proclaim his own Macedonian plans of conquest. The clever idea occurred to him of representing the war as a war of revanche, in which vengeance was to be taken for the crimes once perpetrated by Xerxes on the temples of the Greek gods. This idea emanates from Philip, not from Isocrates, as is generally assumed, for it was completely foreign to him. We see and admire the delicate insight with which this statesman could enter into the Greek mentality, and how shrewdly he took up his position as a true Heraclid, in elevating the national war into a religious war of vengeance. At the same time, he drew a spiritual parallel between his own enterprise and the great age of the Persian Wars. Probably this parallel also occupied him at the Congress, when he connected the alliance with the universal peace. For, at the coming of Xerxes II, the allied Greeks had concluded a peace which applied to the whole country. So Philip rose in the first session of the council, and proposed that he, with his Macedonian army, and the contingents of the Greek allies, should wage war on Persia, to take vengeance for those crimes of Xerxes against the Greek sanctuaries. Thereupon, the representatives voted the war, and, as it was not an ordinary punishment of a member of the League, they specially gave Philip the supreme command of the Persian war, with the title of Commander Strategos, with unlimited power. After these brilliant successes, Philip returned to Macedonia. Next spring, 336, he sent across the Dardanelles a vanguard of 10,000 men under Parmenio and Attalus, to prepare in the first instance for the liberation of the cities of Asia Minor. More than this, Philip could not do, for a few months afterwards he was murdered. The work he accomplished at Corinth has been here depicted as a compromise between his Macedonian policy of power and the Pan-Hellenic program of Isocrates, a compromise in which the Macedonian interests were the most prominent. To some extent, the wishes of Isocrates were fulfilled, but in forms which he did not contemplate, for they were fulfilled on the basis of Philip's chief aim, the domination of Greece. Yet, in estimating his work at Corinth, we may say that, if it had been granted him, instead of dying at 47, to conduct a successful war against Persia and rule for some further decades, his reorganization of Greece, and especially the completion of the universal peace, which was necessary for the prosperity of his Macedonian kingdom, would also have had beneficent effects for the Greek world. It was the gradually ripening plans of Alexander for world domination, which were quite unknown to his father, that altered the conditions of life for the Corinthian League. What a powerful impression Philip made on his contemporaries is shown by the words of Theopompus, the historian, who thus in the beginning of his Philippica introduces his subject. Taken all in all, Europe has never yet produced such a man as Philip, the son of Amyantus.